Chapter 4 The Rise of Sumerian City-States 4.1 Introduction. In Chapter 3, learned how people began farming and living in small villages during Neolithic times. In this chapter, you'll discover how some small villages grew into large, complex cities. These villages were located in a land of rolling hills and low plains called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that means the land between the rivers. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Cities first appeared in the southern part of this land in an area called Sumer. The earliest cities in Sumer date back to 3500 BC. These first cities were like small, independent countries. Each had their own ruler and their own farmland to provide food. For this reason, they are called city-states. Imagine that you are visiting one of these early cities. You see a walled settlement surrounded by farmland that supplies food for the city. The strong city walls are built of sun-baked bricks. Moats or ditches filled with water surround the walls. The moats help keep out enemies. During an attack, people living outside the city walls fled inside for protection. As you gaze on the city, you may wonder how it came to be built. Why didn't people in Mesopotamia go on living in small villages as their ancestors had done for thousands of years? Why did large city-states grow up here in the land between two rivers? In this chapter, you'll find out. 4.2 Mesopotamia, a difficult environment. Mesopotamia was not an easy place to live. The northern part was hilly and received rain. The southern part was low plains, or flat land. The sun beat down fiercely on the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. There was little rain. The Mesopotamians were farmers, and farms need water. The rivers brought water to the plains when they flooded, but for most of the year the soil was hard and dry. On the plains, building materials were difficult to find. There was plenty of weeds that grow near rivers, but there were few trees to provide wood. Even stones were scarce, and there were very few natural barriers to keep out enemies. Mesopotamians faced four key problems as they tried to survive in this environment: food shortages in the hills, an uncontrolled water supply on the plains, difficulties in building and maintaining irrigation systems to serve the needs of several villages at once, and attacks by neighboring communities. Over time, Mesopotamians found solutions to these problems. Let's explore how their solutions led to the building of some of the first cities in the world. As you learned in the last chapter, Chapter 4, Section 3, Food Shortages in the Hill. As you learned in the last chapter, in Neolithic times, people in some areas of the world began farming. One of these areas was the rolling foothills of the Zagros Mountains in northern Mesopotamia. Mild weather and plentiful rains made the foothills a good place to farm. The wooded hills provided timber for building shelters. There were plenty of stones in the hills for tool-making. Over several thousand years, these conditions allowed the population in Mesopotamia to grow dramatically. Then problems arose. By 5000 BC, some historians believe, farmers in the Zagros foothills did not have enough land to grow food for the increasing number of people. As a result, villages began to suffer from food shortages. Below the foothills and to the south, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers ran through flat plains. The plains covered a large area of land, and no one lived there. During most of the year, the land was very hard and dry, and the plains lacked trees and stones for making shelters and tools. Yet the plains held promise too. In the spring, the rivers flooded, bringing precious water. Perhaps farms could be built there. Driven by the need for food, people moved out of the foothills and onto the plains. This region became known as Sumer, and its people would be called the Sumerians. Chapter 4, Section 4, Uncontrolled Water Supply in the River Valley. The farmers who moved to Sumer faced many challenges. One of the biggest was the uncontrolled water supply. During the spring, rain and melted snow from the mountains flowed into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, causing them to flood across the plains. But no one could be sure exactly when the floods would come. If it happened after farmers planted their crops, their young plants would be washed away. For much of the rest of the year, the sun-baked soil was dry and hard as stone. Hot, strong winds blew thick layers of dust across the ground. Faced with such dramatic seasonal changes, farmers had to constantly struggle to raise crops. Either they had too little water or they had too much. To succeed in growing food, they needed to control the water so they would have a reliable water supply all year round. So, Sumerian farmers began to create irrigation systems to provide water for their fields. They built earth walls called levees along the sides of the river to prevent flooding. When the land was dry, they poked holes in the levees. The water plowed through the holes and into the thirsty fields. Over time, the Sumerians learned other ways to control the supply of water. They dug canals to shape the paths the water took. They also constructed dams along the river to block the water and force it to collect in pools they had built. The water was stored in these reservoirs for later use. Chapter 4, Section 5. Difficulties in building and maintaining a complex irrigation system. Irrigation systems provided enough water for Sumerian farmers to grow plenty of food. But now a new problem arose: how to maintain the irrigation system across village boundaries. The irrigation system passed through many villages as it carried water from the river to the fields. The system had to be maintained constantly. The canals had to be cleaned regularly as they became clogged with silt, very fine mud. One clogged canal could spoil the entire system. Farmers could no longer live apart or in small groups. They were connected for miles around by the canals. They had to work together for the common good. Gradually, villages came to depend on each other to build and maintain their complex irrigation system. Workers from different villages probably worked together. They cleared the silt from the canals to keep them from clogging. They scooped water from one reservoir into another to make sure the water levels were balanced. As the Sumerians worked together, they began to create larger communities. Between 3500 and 3000 BC, villages grew into towns. Some towns in summer became cities with populations as great as several thousand people. Chapter 4, Section 6, Attacks by Neighboring Communities. As Sumerian cities grew, they fought over the right to use more water. Sometimes cities located upriver, closer to where the rivers begins, built new canals or blocked other cities' canals. In this way, they kept water from reaching the cities that were downriver or further from where the river begins. Fights over water became so intense that they led to bloodshed and killing. Sumerians began to look for ways to protect their cities from their neighbors. The plains provided no natural barriers for protections. There were no mountain ranges or rushing rivers to keep out enemies. So Sumerians began to build strong walls around their cities. The walls were made of mud bricks that were baked into the sun until they were hard. The Sumerians also dug moats outside the city walls to prevent enemies from entering the city. Most people lived in houses behind the walls. While the farms lay outside in case of attack, farmers fled the fields and took safety inside the city walls. The walled cities of Sumer were like independent countries. Historians called them city-states. By 3000 BC, most Sumerians lived in city-states. Chapter 4, Section 7, From Small Farming Villages to Large City-States. As you've seen, beginning around 3500 BC, the Sumerians went from living in small farming villages to building large, walled cities. How and why did this happen? The answer lies in the problems the Sumerians faced and how they solved them. A basic challenge for any group is how to provide food for itself. Food shortages had forced settlers in Mesopotamia to move from the foothills down to the river valley. There, farmers faced the problem of having either too much water or too little. To control the water supply, Sumerians built a complex irrigation system. The system crossed the village boundaries, so the Sumerians had to cooperate with one another. This led them to live in larger communities, the first cities. Each of these cities was like an independent country. Often these city-states fought with one another. To defend themselves, Sumerians built walls and dug moats around their cities. By 3000 BC, most Sumerians lived in the walled city-states.